Performance is one of the biggest issues that a lot of people are encountering in their opening session of Monster Hunter Wild. From low quality to high-end machines, there seems to be a variety of issues that are causing a massive drop in frames per second. In this video today, I want to help you increase your FPS and performance in Monster Hunter Wilds by going through some of the settings and explaining what options are worth dropping for increased performance while not sacrificing too much visual fidelity. If this is your first time on my channel, the way I do things is by uploading the knowledge in my videos. So with that being said, let me just give you some hot and fast tips. Right out of the box, make sure you've updated your NVIDIA drivers. Also turn on DLSS 4.0, which I'll show you how to turn on in the next section. It uses transformers to help improve performance, while DLSS 3.5 is more targeted at ray tracing. And every single card, I think it's like 2, 3, 4, and 5 series NVIDIA cards can all use DLSS 4.0. I don't know how you would leverage this on AMD, unfortunately. Outside of that, some graphic options to turn down are shadows as always, but make sure you also turn down distant shadow quality. It might not immediately give you a bump, but it's one that plays out as you go through the world because it's less things to draw and render. Also, grass tree quality and grass tree sway can contribute to nearly a whole gig of VRAM usage. Drop those as low as you can. Set texture filtering quality to low or trilinear, mesh quality to medium, turn volumetric fog to low, variable rate shading to performance, render distance to low, and lastly, surface quality to low. I think if you run with all that, you'll notice at least a 10 frames per second improvement in the game at bare minimum, but this is definitely a your mileage may vary type of scenario, as each gaming rig is going to be different. But that's the too long didn't watch this entire video. From here on, I'll go through some of the features and show how little or vast of an effect that they have on FPS, as well as explaining what they do so you can decide how or what to tweak more of. Feel free to navigate to any part of the video that interests you the most using the chapters below, but if that's all you wanted to know, go ahead and shut the video down. I want to respect your time and get you back to hunting some monsters. Before you head out, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you find the information in this video helpful. Also, if you've not yet picked up the game, you can do so using my Fanatical link in the description. It's 18% off through them, and I also get an 8% commission, which goes towards my Mini Aussies Endless Toy Fund. Lastly, check me out on Twitch, linked below, where I will be streaming this game, as well as plenty of others, and doing game giveaways. But let's get started on my performance guide for Monster Hunter Wilds. So the first thing to go through, like I said, is going to be turning on DLSS 4.0. So what you want to do is bring up your NVIDIA app. It'll be down here in the section that says NVIDIA settings. You'll go ahead and click that. And on the left side, you'll see home, drivers, and graphics. If you're on mobile, I'm sorry, you probably can't see as well here, but just go ahead and turn on the third option for graphics. You want to navigate and find Monster Hunter Wilds. If it is not in this menu, you press the vertical ellipses right here, these little little blips. You'll press add a program, and then from there you'll go ahead and navigate to wherever your Steam apps, common, and then Monster Hunter Wilds is located. That's probably in your C drive. Mine's in my D drive. Usually it's in your like users profile, something like that. But again, find the Steam folder, go to Steam apps, then to common, and to Monster Hunter Wilds, and you'll see this is your executable, your application. It'll say right here in the file type. Go ahead and select that and press open. Now you can use a DLSS 4.0 switcher. I just do it through the app here because I just don't want to deal with any kind of BS redundancy or issues, whatever it is. So once we have this in here, we have Monster Hunter Wilds, we have driver settings, we have a lot of stuff here. Just ignore them. What we want to look for is DLSS override model presets. It should be the third one from the top. We're going to click this, and by default, it'll say use same settings for all DLSS technologies. We don't want that. We want use different settings for each DLSS technology. We click that blip, and at the bottom, we're going to see super resolution. That is what is going to turn on DLSS 4.0. It's going to use the transformers to do the super resolution. And I ain't talking about Autobots and Decepticons. We click this, and we want latest, not use the 3D application setting, which I believe it'll be by default. So we want, it'll look like this. We want to turn it to this, to latest. That'll turn it on to 4.0. This works for every game, and it will force 4.0 to be active. It can be a little jankety until native 4.0 support works, but it is something that has improved for every game I've ever played since it's been launched into this app. So for example, I was using it with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and it vastly helped me out with my frames. This should be the first thing that you do. And if you're using any of the DLSS options like, performance and ultra and quality and so on and so forth, this will clear up a lot of the blurriness that sometimes gives it and makes it to look also sharper. So this will help you out quite a bit in your frames per second alone. Loading into the game, let's take a look at some stuff. So for starters, we're going to be using this location in the game. If you've not been here yet, I'm just not going to say anything else. It's just this location. And the reason I'm using it is because we have these massive penis gouts of fire in the background, and it's going to create a lot of reflective surfaces, a lot of shadows, a lot of light to play with. So it's a good baseline for our early testing to show off the impacts of frames per second. Now, in addition to that, let's take a look at my specs, because this is really going to be something that is, you're going to be basically looking at this as a comparison to your specs, right? So I have a pretty beefy system here because this is my full-time job. So I need a system that can maintain it. The biggest thing that we're going to see here is that I have a pretty decent 12th gen, what the hell is this thing called? CPU, Intel CPU. Also, I have a lot of VRAM at just shy of 24 gigs because I have an RTX 4090. Those things are going to be very important because that VRAM, as soon as that runs out, the game's just going to start running slower. And since this is a Capcom game, that CPU since it's an i9, it has a lot of cores for me to take advantage of. It's going to help me out quite a bit. Some things that you can do just right out the gate, like I've said before, are your GPU driver version. Make sure you update those in your NVIDIA app. Also, too, if you log into a private server or a private lobby or a squad lobby with your friends, whatever it is, rather than joining a massive public lobby, that can help you out quite a bit in your CPU performance because the game just doesn't have to constantly render brand new people coming in and out of your lobby. And that's also part of the GPU process as well. But just removing yourself from as much mobiles as you can helps with the performance. So if you can play either in a private lobby with your friends, whatever it is, I just have been playing in a squad lobby the entire time with my friends. So I have not gone into a massive public lobby with 50, 100, whatever people it is. So those things can help you out right out the gate. But these are my specs. And in addition to that, I am running in a 4K screen resolution. So I want to talk about this stuff up front so that you have an idea of how we'll be testing, what our testing bed is, what the specs that I'm dealing with, and how I'm trying to establish a control for these tests to give us a frame of reference for what is going to happen through a lot of the tweaks of our graphical options. And it is worth noting too, I'm going to be using a pretty static environment to show this off. But when I talk about certain things, I will say, hey, you're not going to notice an improvement from, say, distant shadows. But once you jump into the game world, when that is a constant rendering feature as you progress forward in the open world, that is when you're going to notice that frames per second increase, whereas we might not see it as much right here. So we're going to go through my settings and how I've configured them and talk about those individual settings and how they're going to affect your game. So I'm using FrameGen because I'm using a 40 series GPU. If you're not using a 40 series GPU or higher, then this is going to be disabled, but it will give you quite a bit of frames. Since this is such a set situation, if you can do it, do it. If you cannot do it, then don't do it. There was an issue before in the beta where this would crash if we were running overlays. That is not the problem now. Now, upscaling mode is probably going to be the one thing the majority of us will use. I have a pretty good rig, so NVIDIA DLAA is worth it for me. But really, honestly, I'd say balance between one of the three of these. Balanced is a good way to go because it just really gives you a good middle ground. Quality is great if you have, I would say, a 3080, 3090, or any of the 40 series GPUs. Anything else, even if you have a 3080, depending on which 3080 you've got, hit balanced or lower. Ultra performance is going to be great if you're still on a 20 or 10 series GPU, but you'll be pretty much fine on balance for the majority of your situations. This just allows you to deal with upscaling, which then you can deal with upscaling sharpness to increase the visual fidelity. But since we already talked about using DLSS 4.0 earlier, that's going to help you out to not make it so that this makes it just for a blow, like a blurry blowout where you're like, I don't really like this. I feel like I'm just playing like with no glasses on or like 10/20 vision. So don't worry about the blurriness that you typically deal with upscaling mode because of that DLSS 4.0. Use whichever one of these modes gives you the most frames per second. It's just going to be a mileage may vary thing. Me showing you the frames on this is not going to help you out. Then we're going to come into ray tracing. Just shut this off. Just always shut this off. If you really want to push it, you can, but it's just not worth it for games that don't rely on realism, right? You're fighting over the top bloated Pokemon monsters. There's no reason to jack this bad boy up to a low, medium, or high. We're not playing Cyberpunk, where the game hinges upon a lot of that stuff. And ray tracing too depends so much on your graphics card. It's just going to put so much stress on it depending on which one you've got. I've got a 4090. Sure, I could probably put this up, and even let's do that. Let's establish this that we're running right now at there we go, 77 frames per second. So if I go and turn on ray tracing, just to show you, let's put it at the highest setting here. My frames just drop almost by half. And this is, of course, I'm using OBS in the background, as I've said before, or I think I've said before. So I'm going to lose a lot of frames per second showing this off. And this is a constant rendering feature that's going to be even more difficult as I go and encounter anything that's got water in it, anything like that. Ray tracing is just something you should definitely not play around with, because it just is, unless you really have the rig to do it, just keep it off, especially if you're struggling right now. Even high-end rigs are really struggling to keep good frames per second, so I wouldn't even dabble with it. Now let's talk about our textures. So we have 4 big texture settings: texture quality, texture filtering quality, mesh quality, and fur quality. And I guess there's really, isn't there another one over here? Yeah, no, not really. These 4 settings are seemingly not a whole big impact on things. Like, for example, I'm going to take our highest texture, and let's just do this really quick too. Remember, right in this scene right here, we're running at 75. Let's just say 75 frames per second. So I have turned on and downloaded the highest texture quality. I actually don't want to use that. I'm going to use high, but let me just show you the difference here. We're going to drop this all the way to low, let it re-render and kind of pop in. Not too much of a difference, and only a 5 frame. Well, there we go. We got about 3-4 frames more. Let's just say 3 frames and just, round down. It's not too much of a difference, and it does give you a little bit more visual fidelity out of it, right? Like you can see, but the overall frames impact on it isn't massive. I just am not going to waste VRAM on that setting if I don't have to. So I'm going to keep my texture quality, even though I can run it at highest. I don't know why I said it like that. At the highest, I'm just going to keep it at high. The high res textures, I'm sure it's worth it for really cool pictures I want to take, but by and large, it's not worth it. As you can see at the VRAM settings up here, when I put it to highest, it jumps it up to 7.4. At high, it still looks really good, and it's at 5.9, right? So we're going to get quite a bit of longevity out of that. Now, our texture filtering quality is basically how textures are filtered from oblique angles by the camera. This is a constant measurement that is done as you move the camera around. And there's, I think it's aniscopic, I think is the other version. And then there's trilinear and bilinear. Trilinear and bilinear is what we always used to use until the last decade or so when we got into aniscopic or anisoptic. I can't pronounce it because I don't know what the actual word is because I'm not smart. But you can see that right now at the highest, we're looking at 5.9 gigs. Let's drop it to the lowest. This is going to drop our estimated usage up there. Not a significant amount. You can see it's all about the same. But what this does is it allows for less computations to be made constantly while we're in motion. And we'll see that this is the lowest setting. I'm going to turn back on our HUD. And our frames per second are going to stabilize, hanging out at around 79. And again, since we're kind of in one area, this isn't too crucial or huge. As we play through the actual game world and move our camera around, that's when we're going to notice lots of frames dropping. This filtering method sometimes causes you to move like very quickly and cause your frames to drop rapidly because it has to now quickly adjust to a new filtering direction because of the new camera angle. So you can see we hung out around like mid 60s with the lowest setting here. Let me just pop this bad boy into the highest setting, which I keep it at. It's not too much of a difference, but if you are struggling, every little bit counts. So now you can see our frames per second are just a little bit above it. Just depends on what kind of graphics card you've got, but it's back down to 65 here. So it's not going to increase your VRAM too much or anything like that. I just would think that run with whatever one isn't going to give you any choppiness when you play. That's the big crucial thing, right? Like, yeah, sure, I didn't show you any difference in frames per second, and I didn't show you any difference in performance because both settings aren't a burden for my graphics card. But for yours, one might cause you a lot of judder, stuttering, like I just did right there, stammering, a lot of graphical hitches when you move the camera sharply. So go ahead and shut that down if you need to. Now, mesh quality is a good one. This is one where you get a direct visual difference in your character. So let me get over here to a wall so I can really jam the camera up my own ass, metaphorically speaking. Well, maybe not that wall. Let me get this guy right going here. So get this dude right there. We go. So he's right there. You can see he's kind of got a little bit of a sheen to his face. His hair is nice and full and beautiful looking because we're on the highest setting. And let's go ahead. And right now we're running around 70 frames per second. If we just kind of tweak this, even in the preview, you can see what happens, right? Your eyes go from blurry, your hair goes from like clear to a little bit blurry. Basically, high and highest just seems to change the way the light plays with that, or maybe adds a little more white pixels in there, whatever. But as soon as we drop to medium, you can notice it's a pretty drastic change. And we've looked at our VRAM at the top from 5.9 down to 5.92. So not a huge drop on our VRAM, but let's take a look at that visual change on the character that we were just taking a look at. So now his hair is a little bit like thinner. That sheen's not as apparent. Even my character over there, a lot of the play of the light around him is flatter. It's just more of, hey, here's my face. And his eyes look a little bit weirder. They look a little less clear. So yeah, you're going to lose some visual fidelity here. But I have noticed that turning that mesh quality down does help when dealing with a lot of bodies in close proximity all the time, especially as you're moving through any of the camps, any of the cities. You can see we've got a lot of characters over here. We're going to walk through 67 or some odd frames per second right now on the lowest version. And just kind of running through them just to force the game to have those be in front of me. That's that on the lowest. And if I bring this up here to the highest setting, let this stabilize a little bit more. There we go. So 73, 74. What we're really going to see is just that the game now has to render each one of these a little bit better and sharper. And it just going to keep us kind of bouncing around a little bit more, right? We're at 70, we're at 62. It's a little bit more of a hectic frames jump depending on the situation you have at hand. So this is one that I definitely think that just dropping it to medium is going to help you out if you are really struggling. But even just high, I think just spares you a little bit of VRAM if you can. Fur quality is an interesting one. This one, it's kind of like hair simulation in a lot of other games. I would turn it to low because unless you really need flowing, beautiful locks, you can see it almost gives us, it's 0.07 VRAM, but that adds up, right? If I take both of these down, now we're at 5.85 VRAM. It just gives us a little bit more to play around with, a little more headroom. And this isn't one you're really going to notice a huge difference on. It's mainly the light play and the way that that hair actually reacts through movement. It's not going to be too big of a visual loss for you. So I would definitely turn that one down as well. So jumping into some environmental settings, we have more to tweak around. And the first three are, depending on, kind of crucial and kind of not. So right now we're at 6.92 GPU right now. And I'm going to go ahead and take our sky and cloud quality all the way to lowest. And you can see that it does have a pretty good effect, right? It does go from 6.92 to 6.79. And here is the lowest sky. Now, of course, I'm beautifully gifted with a cloudy, overcast sky. So that is not going to be ideal for this. And I've tried to reload and change this thing a bunch of times, but still nothing has worked. And you can see it's roughly like 100 frames per second as I look up, which kind of turns off the rest of the rendering, right? But you're never going to look like this when you're playing the video game. You're going to spend the majority of the time looking straight forward. So that's what really matters here, is how much this really gets us. And with the sky quality, it just makes it so it's less constant or big fancy objects to render up in that direction. So if you can see from this angle, we're hanging around 80 frames per second. And if we drop this or raise this all the way back up to highest, that frames per second, as it kind of stabilizes here, isn't too huge. It's just a constant thing. So like I've said so many times, we just want to reduce the load on our VRAM if we can. And sparing us 2 or 3 frames per second on something small like the cloud quality, which you can see doesn't really have too much of a visual effect. Like this is the highest setting and it's not that much, more, it doesn't have that much more depth to it or anything like that. And in a blue sky, it does look a little bit different, but even then the game gives you a good display difference between what this looks like of highest and lowest. It's just a little bit more blur. So it just makes for clearer, prettier clouds. Dropping this to lowest or at least medium is not going to hurt you too much. I can have it at high. It's fine for me. Now for our tree quality though, this one is a pretty huge one. So this is at high right now. This is at high right now. Look at the VRAM. We drop it to low, brings it all the way to 6.81. That of all the ones we've taken a look at here, that's a 0.11 drop. That's pretty significant. The thing is though, that it has a pretty significant change to the game too. Like looking at those trees into the distance there, bring up just our HUD once more. You can see that those trees are looking kind of sparse, not too much vegetation on them as it were. Our frames per second here is hanging out at 76, 77. As you can see, this one just looks real ramshackle. This one just looks like a sturdy wind would knock this bad boy over. And if I bring our trees all the way back up to high, they become beautiful again. As a result, though, our frames per second hang out at roughly the same spot. Moving around is, of course, something that it kind of gives you a better idea. If I were just to stay there with the frames per second, it's not going to be as good. Uh-oh. Didn't mean to get on you, big boy. And over there, you can see it's got those trees don't look as sparse anymore. So the frames per second might not be a huge thing in this. It's going to give you a couple here and there. The trees will look visually better, but the biggest thing too is that it's going to help lower that VRAM, as I'll just keep saying throughout this entire damn video. And then the tree grass sway, I couldn't give you an actual direct representation of what this is going to do for you from a VRAM perspective or a frames per second perspective, but reducing anything like that, right? In a map like this right now, there's not going to be too much of a difference. You can see we've got some sway on this grass. Let's go ahead and look at it. And the frames per second on it, it's 70, 80. We're not going to get too much of a difference if I shut this off. But you will deal with situations where there is a lot of rain and thunder, there's a ton of wind, and it's causing a ton of sway, a lot of different changes to grass and to the trees. I'd recommend shutting this off if you just don't have a 30 series or higher. I just think it's going to spare you as much as you can from this situation. And it's not as big of a difference too in a map like this where nothing's really going on, right? But if this was that, there's a situation that you're going to get into in the very beginning portions of the game where you fight a monster and it's just crashing thunder everywhere and there's wind whipping around. My one friend who has a 3070, he was struggling in that moment because there was just so many more elements moving via the wind. I didn't have a problem with it. So you can see that does have a very big effect on lower generation graphics cards, even though we can see here, there's just not much of a difference turning this on or off. So if you're looking at it when you're playing going, this isn't helping me right now, it's going to find a time that it will definitely help you. And versus this too as well, wind simulation quality, turn this low. You just probably don't need it. It's basically how the trees and everything are going to react. Right now they're kind of doing a light little swaying and everything like that. It's the nuance to that sway. There we go. There we go. So having that be, see the trees are a lot more static now. They're not kind of doing that gentle like throbbing that they were doing a little bit ago. So it's one that you're definitely going to get more out of if you have the grass and tree sway up. But as it is, just turn both of these features off for your lower end GPUs, mid to low range 30 series and lower. Just don't even touch it. It's not worth it. But I'm going to turn it back on. Water effects too. I don't know why this is such a big one for me. I love water effects in video games. For me, it's like playing Sea of Thieves. If you turn the water effects low, it just feels like you've lost 80% of the visual fidelity of the game. So I like this on. I'll suffer through lower frames to have this on. So I think this is a your mileage may vary thing as well. Do you mind having water that doesn't look as fun or as characteristic, right? We have the little splishy splashies, my little Spartacos making over there. All sorts of fun action. You can see how the water ripples. Turning this off just makes a lot of that not as pronounced, not as big, not as animated. There is still some, right? Like obviously, but it's not as, there's not like little droplets or anything like that. So those things are little tiny things that can afford you little bumps without too much of a VRAM change. I mean, you can see too, these things give you an indication of, okay, is this going to be a direct change in my frames per second? Is it going to be a VRAM storage I can basically make up? Because VRAM is going to be a constantly cycling thing that you have to deal with. Now, there are 3 other settings here that I cannot render in real time. I have to change, I have to shut the game, or go to the tile menu and shut it on and off. Surface quality, you've seen how good my GPU is. It's just not worth it to make this jump from the low to high setting for essentially the rendering quality of terrain and geographical features in close proximity to the hunter. It's just not worth it. Like, it's basically going to save you a little bit. It's visually going to give you a little bit for a larger demand GPU wise. Again, you've seen I've got a 4090. I turned it to low. It wasn't worth it for me. Now, sand snow quality is a different one. This one, since it is GPU driven and less of a burden on your VRAM, I did put it at the highest for me, but you can really get away with medium to lowest because it's not that huge of a change. It's just noticing the nuance in little cracks and little crevices and stuff like that. I can't show you right now, but it's not gonna be too big of one to turn down. Don't worry about it. Render distance though is probably going to be, like I've said before, one of the biggest ones that you can really get a good amount of value out of, because this is of course the number of players or characters displayed in lobbies and the distance monsters in endemic life will display in the field. It will cause for a lot of pop in. Well, in this game it's more of a slow fade in. So turning this to low or medium is going to really help you out. I even have it set to high with what I've got. I just don't need that extra burden, and it is CPU driven more so than GPU driven. So if you have a low end CPU, drop this to the lowest you can possibly drop this to, all the way down to low if you can stomach it. And it's just noticing when things render. So it's not too big of a hindrance to you. Now this will also play into distant shadow quality. So let's now pivot into our shadow conversation. So shadow quality here is the one thing that all of us really tweak, the first thing that we do when it comes to graphics. I'm going to go ahead and put this on highest, and our VRAM usage is going to jump up by 0.7 roughly, right? Just a little lower than 0.7. And the difference in shadow quality in just this picture is really not enough to justify almost a whole gig of VRAM usage right there for me. Like again, it's just a blurrier, less clear shadow. So here's my current shadow. Let me see if I have, here's some good shadows right here. Here's my current shadows. They're there, you know. I don't like when shadows are just kind of circles. That just kind of feels funky. But if we turn this to the highest setting, let me actually turn on this too. So right now, hanging out around 80, give or take. Let's play with this. Shadow quality to the highest. Again, see, that's not too much of a difference, but we almost, like, we just lose frames per second here. And right now in this situation when we're not moving, it's hard to gauge it because the game can stabilize a set rendered location. But as I move through this, you can see it's now having to render all these pretty detailed shadows. Our frames drop pretty regularly down to like 73, then bounce back up. So especially as you deal with a lot of the lower light situations in this game. You'll be going through caves, you'll be going through things with a lot of reflective surfaces that then force more shadows. It's just not worth it. It is not worth it at all. And my GPU utilization is all the way up there, as to be expected, because I'm playing a video game, but still. Now, if I take this and we drop this down to the lowest, so we go from there's shadows to there is like a LaCroix essence of shadow, right? Like there's shadow next to shadow here, not a full. Don't attack me. I'm doing a video. It would be nice of you if you just left me alone, Quamatress. And our frames per second, yeah, they go up, right? Because we don't have to render as much. And if we just stay still, should bounce above 80 now, maybe lock up to 85, 86. So just reducing the quality of those shadows is going to help you. And I like medium, but lowest still, you can see it's not like it's that huge. You're not like, oh crap, dude, there's just nothing on the ground. Now, let's look over here, back to medium, at the biggest thing of the shadows outside of their actual quality is the distant shadow quality. So just the quality of shadows far away from the hunter. What that means is over there in the distance, all those shadows, that big, huge lightning rod, that shadow right there, all those like distant shadows that are not in close proximity to me. Let's take a look. If I just we'll freeze the frame here. We're at 77, 78. And we'll turn that up to low. The world gets a little flatter, but it saves us quite a bit of VRAM, and our frames per second should now start to go a little bit higher here. Sometimes it just kind of doesn't make much of a direct effect when it's a set image like this. And also keep in mind too, this has a active night and day cycle. So shadows are constantly moving in this game. As you can see, that shadow starts to make its way slowly towards me. And that distant shadow quality, it changes a little bit of the game. But you use this in conjunction with shadow distance, adjust the distance from the hunter from which shadows are rendered by objects in the game. So if we turn this to near, far, wherever you are, and that to low, it allows for less. You can see there's not as much shadow back there anymore. And it allows us to get just a little bit more frames per second, a little bit more stability out of the visual fidelity of all of these shadows. And I guess too, what might be a pretty nice one to see here is with this too being at the lowest, what does that look like? And you can see with all three of those turned down all the way, it's not going to be too big of a difference for you. You're not going to be sitting there going, man, this looks like crap. And turning them all the way back on, it's going to pop for sure and look good, but it's not going to be something that's going to completely floor you. So I think it's important to show the juxtaposition between these lowest and high settings so you can see how much shadow tweaking you want to do, because I think it's the one that people really play the most with when it comes to their video games. Contact shadows too is a good one. So you can see that if I turn this off, there's nothing around me that probably makes a best use case of it. It's more in that actual picture, but it's basically how shadow interplays with objects. Does it allow it to wrap around objects and look a little bit softer, a little bit more genuine? This is more of a post-processing effect, so you shouldn't notice too much of a difference. Post-processing means that the graphics are already rendered, and it's essentially applying a filter. I wouldn't really worry about this one too much. If you want to, go for it if you really want. Now, ambient light quality is one that is a direct rendering. So contact shadows is a quick and easy fix. But ambient light quality, you can see it has quite a bit of demand here. So if I put it on high, we go to 7.11. If I put it on low, it goes to 8.85. Because it just is going to change so much more of how, because other applications are going to increase their rendering distance here, or rendering whatever the hell. So we've got that set over here, and that at 78%, 78 frames per second. Bringing the options back up for that. There. And this is the rendering quality of light reflected off objects in the distance. And there we go, brings it back just to give you an idea of what that looks like difference-wise. So I always just keep like ambient light stuff or volumetric fog, stuff like that to like medium, because you can see that it's not too big of a change for me. And contact shadows too, it's just kind of, what kind of game am I playing? And lastly, ambient occlusion is the quality of shadows in areas where light is obstructed. So basically so light is obstructed because this has a tarp over it, right? Or light is obstructed here because this is blocking that. So this is just kind of gives you more of an actual reality of a shadow. And it's not too huge of an effect, but shutting it off is just going to make for a flatter world. Turning it on makes for a more dynamic one. So you can see right down over here the difference, as you can see that shadow plays right there. So let's go put it on high, show you what that looks like. And let's shut that off for you real quick. This is one that's you're going to notice a little bit less in the open world, but one you're going to notice a lot when you go to any of the subterranean areas of the game, which is going to be, like I said before, plenty of those areas. So keep those things in mind as you play through them. But that gives you an idea of all the shadows. Let me conclude this video by talking about more of our post-processing effects, which are on the last page, as well as that juxtaposition between high and low. So everything on this page, for the most part, we're going to talk about some that are not, are relegated to a your mileage may vary type of situation based off of what you like. Do you like bloom in your video games? Turn this on or off. It is a post-processing effect. I like it, so I turn it on. Motion blur. Do you like this in your video games? Turn it on or off. Vignette effect. I don't know why you would ever have this on. Screen space reflections is a post-processing effect, but it is one that does have a demand. So turning it off does save you a little bit. You can see the difference here between the water. The water behind me is just not going to give you a good indication because this is basically how light reacts with things that have reflections. Reflective surfaces like a dew-dripped cave wall, the actual water here when you go into any snowy areas where there's ice. So screen space reflections do have an effect on those things. It's again, what do you like out of the visual look of your game? The effect on the actual graphics isn't going to be too massive until you get to the snow area. Depth of field, turning it on or off here, it's up to you. I don't like playing with depth of field in games unless I'm playing like a Baldur's Gate, where I constantly am talking to characters, and it's nice to have a nice blurred background. I find the depth of field in this, when it comes to talking to characters, just I don't really like the look of it, so it's not for me. Now, variable rate shading is not a post-processing effect. It has to do with how pixels are rendered. So turning this to performance actually not going to show it up here, but it does give you a little bit more because you don't have to deal with all the little particle effects being constantly rendered at the highest quality possible. I think I can show you with that. Usually that my little gauntlet steamy thing, I thought that was affected by it, but it is not, unfortunately. Yeah, maybe a little bit, but not enough to really show. You can see it right here on the little flies more. I turn this to performance. They get a little more pixelated, and that's the big thing, is like all these little particle effects, those things become more pixelated rather than a lot sharper. That's the difference right there. But I definitely think putting this to performance is good because showing you in this instance is not going to be too big of a deal. Showing you when I'm fighting a boss with lightning crashing everywhere, explosions going off, smashing through things as they go through their big flame attacks and whatnot, that's where you're going to notice an increase here with variable rate shading. Now, the last two in this are not post-processing. You've got volumetric fog, which I usually actually have it low. I don't know why I have it high right there. Turn this low. Turn this low almost all the time. Adjust the quality of fog produced by dust and particles in the air. Affects how beams of light and such are displayed. God rays are usually done better with volumetric fog being high. God rays being the rays of light as it usually looks like a canopy of trees. Just turn it low. It was one thing that really hampered Cyberpunk 2077, and I think it also hampers this game. I would just turn that to low. Now, subsurface scattering is our last feature here, and it's basically how light plays across objects even further. So you can turn this on or off. You can see my character off, on, off, on. It just makes for a softer look on the character's features. It will become demanding though when you're in a populated area. I would turn this off if you have a 20 or lower series GPU. 30 or higher, you should be just fine because it's still not that crazy of an effect. It's basically a little bit of a blur on like organic surfaces or hard surfaces for that matter. So play with those as you see fit. A lot of this stuff is how you prefer the game, right? Like a lot of people hate bloom or hate motion blur. No one likes vignette effect, depth of field, stuff like that. So tweak those things in a way that makes sense for you and your personal preferences as a gamer. And to make a quick point too, most of them, like I've said before, won't have an effect on your performance because they are put on the game after the graphics are rendered most of the time. So it's just a filter applied to stuff. So just to show off the difference here between the highest graphic setting, at least that my computer can maintain, and the lowest graphic setting. So just to show that off really quick, we are using the preset of Ultra right now. There's this thing's in the way, but graphic settings are set to Ultra. You can see that on the right. So we've got our frames per second counter up and everything. You can see that we're running at around 90 frames per second. I also have OBS running. This is going to skew some of my results. So just assume that I'm losing about 5 to 10 frames per second, as I've said throughout this entire video. So just to show you what Ultra looks like in this location that we've talked about before, and I'm just kind of spinning around. And the whole point of this is to show the difference between the highest and the lowest graphical setting to give you a sense of how much is going to change. And it's not a whole lot. I mean, even if I go out into the world, yeah, the world's going to look a little bit less dense, right? Because there's going to be less foliage on the ground and what have you. But reason I'm using here is because there's just so much light for this to kind of bounce off of with this level of graphical setting. So pretty much everything hangs out at around 80 frames per second. That FPS 1% is around 56, and sometimes we drop pretty low and it kind of recovers here, but you get a pretty good idea of what's going on. A really high CPU utilization at Ultra. So this is Ultra. Let's now show off low. With the lowest settings, you can see that, yeah, sure, textures are not as poppy, things are a little bit flatter. My character's eyes look like he's just ripped through some of the jazz cabbage. Our frames per second, though, has increased quite a bit. And stuff like the particle effects on my hand, you can see the kind of wispy effects that are jumping around. They are more pixelated, but by and large, the visual fidelity difference is not so drastic to the point where as you're tweaking these little individual graphical options, you're not going to go, man, well, the game just looks like crap. I mean, there's still quite a bit of visual fidelity, not visual fidelity, I'm going to say that word so many times, but there's still quite a bit of rich visuals here, a lot of good light play that kind of comes across the whole surface. And all of my settings are set to the lowest. Again, just to kind of quickly show that off, we jump into options here, and you can see with the graphic settings, we are set to the lowest. And this just gives you a sense that it's free. You're free to just play with a ton of settings and not get too much of a difference. And as we've talked about, and we will talk about, is just how much the individual settings don't really make much of a difference. It's a lot of settings put together that are really what's going to give you the huge difference. And we can take a look at the frames per second, right? We're hanging out really high up there. Okay, gonna get on my guy, I guess. I'm using mouse and keyboard, so I'm just fat fingering it. 123, 120. We're doing pretty well with our frames now, right? So things are looking really well. And keep in mind too, like I've said before, I am on a 4K monitor, so that will change things for you if you're not on 4K, if you're just hanging out on a 2K or even a 1080p. A lot of this FPS stuff is going to be a lot different for you, but this gives you just a sense of what the differences between ultra and lowest settings are. And now that we've taken a look at both the high and the lowest settings in the game, you can just see them side by side and you get a good sense of what's going on here. Like I've said so many times in this video, there's not too much of a difference between the highest high and the lowest low. So go ahead and find an in-between between all this that makes the most sense for you. I think honestly, if you're having a ton of performance issues, just hit the lowest settings and tweak just the texture stuff. I think if you just did that, you'd have characters that look pretty cool, because what you really care about is how your character looks, right? Characters that look really cool, monsters that look pretty awesome, and the rest of the game that looks pretty damn good, even on the lowest settings. And then once there's more performance and stability patches that come out, which are bound to happen, you can start to move this up. Some other things you can do that are outside of the purview of this video are things like making sure your game is installed on a solid state drive. There's a quote unquote best practice, which is a fucking term I hate. That's why I left the corporate world. But putting your games on a solid state drive that is separate from your operating system are good things to do because you don't have to share that load with the OS. If you have your game on a tape drive, a hard drive, like a spooling drive, that is going to make it an overall slower process for you because of the read-write speed. Upgrading those things can help not just this game, but all games in the future, and don't use those anymore. That should be for like just static storage. You can get an M2 drive. That stuff helps you as well. A lot of this game comes down to CPU and VRAM. Most people will have 12 to 8 gigs of VRAM, unless you have a 4090 behemoth. So that's why so much of this video is geared towards buying you little bytes of VRAM here and there, because if you tweak 4 or 5 settings that do 0.5, you've just overall increased 2 more VRAM usage that you can play around with. Because once you're utilizing so much VRAM, it causes slowdowns across your entire game. So hopefully this video gave you an idea of how to approach performance and really make the best out of what you're trying to do in the game without dropping too much visual fidelity, as I've said so many times in this video. It helps you to know these things so that you can just tweak what you need to and leave the rest as you want. For me, like I've said, I just pretty much make sure texture quality is the best because I want my characters to look the best. And then I do just enough environmental stuff that I'm like, yeah, that looks cool. Looks like a good video game version of environment. The rest, whatever. And then I just screw off the rest of it, right? Like I don't care too much about shadows as long as they're not blobs. And then if cool, I don't need this special little post-processing effect. I'll take this and that and what have you. Even with a 4090, I still need to do those things because I record and stream. So I need to try and get as much, as good graphics as I can get, while at the same time still sparing me system resources since I'm using so much. So if you have any other recommendations for people in the comment section, go ahead and leave them below. Like, hey, you know what? This is a feature that I did that really helped me out. Or I'm using AMD. I'm using this FSR to help me out with AMD. Whatever those situations are, let it be known. I don't have much AMD knowledge, so I can't give you a ton of information, but hopefully this gave you a better idea on how to approach the game and make the graphics work for you rather than have the performance just keeping your head right below water. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.